Well, I barely had time to get the previous saw out of here, and this one popped up, and it was a 4-hour clear out the garage moving sale. It had to happen pretty quickly, and I got over there and they were wanting to deal, so I picked up this Craftsman 10-inch. It has the base with the casters that drop down or lock. So it does roll around, 2 cast iron wings. It has the rip vents, the miter guide, and the factory blade guard, which you don't find all those with every saw. It's a heavy beast. It was all I could do to get it here, and had to take it apart to move it. Yeah, not unusual. A lot of sawdust. This one has quite a bit of cobwebs. I don't think this has been used in a very long time. Some rust on the screw there. I think just some oil will work and some wire brushing. Motor looks to be in pretty good shape. I know it runs. I ran it before I left the place because that's one of the things with these integrated motors. If the motor doesn't run, it's pretty tough to recover. You can't always find the motor. It's not like the ones that you can use a generic motor with a V-belt. With these, you have to have that exact motor. So I wanted to make sure it at least ran, and it did. So we've got a good starting point. Well, every now and then you learn something new if you keep your eyes open. I don't know exactly what this is or what it's made out of, but I picked it up at Harbor Freight and I was thinking, well, it'll work kind of like a wire brush, but maybe it's fiber and I can use it to clean softer parts or get down into corners. But this thing is really aggressive. I've been using it on the rusty tabletop here, and it eats through rust and gets down into corners really well. So let me show you. And like I say, I picked this up at Harbor Freight. I don't know exactly what it is, but it works really well on rust on cast iron. It gets the top cleaned up. Primarily I use that brush on the mini die grinder to get it loosened up, but I went back with a block and some 240 grit emery paper wrapped around the block to kind of flatten and smooth out that surface, get rid of some of the circular marks. It polishes it out, makes it look pretty nice. While I was at it, I went ahead and cleaned up and dismantled the miter guide. And I want to point out the product that I use after I've taken that down to bare metal is WD-40 long-term corrosion inhibitor. This stuff is really good to keep a rust from reoccurring on that bare metal surface. I cleaned off the front, back, and sides of the bed as well, and then cleaned that with the rust, or wiped it down with the rust inhibitor also. Well, I've got this flipped over. I want to go through and do some lubricating. So the doctor is at work here. I use these syringes. You can get them on eBay. They're used for refilling ink cartridges for printers. They have a blunt end. There is not a sharp tip on it. I've pulled some motor oil up into it. This allows me to go down into some fairly tight spots and put just a few drops of oil exactly where I want it in some very tight places. So rather than trying to get an oil can down there, I find these to be pretty handy. Now let me show you one of the things that annoys me on some of these cheaper machines. So this is the follower that follows this screw for the up-down action on the blade. I would like to change this little rubber washer right here. I'd like to put something else in there because this one is pretty deteriorated. But the problem is right here on the end is not a nut but a clip that this whole thing is just squeezed together, and that clip is squeezed on. We might be able to get it off, and it might be reusable, but it might not. So you either have to have another one of those clips and then kind of squeeze it together with some pliers or something to get it back on. It'd be nice if that was a nut so we could disassemble this, remove it, clean it up, put it all back together, put the nut on and adjust it. But that's not possible. And that's the difference between the bigger, heavier contractor's saw and something lighter like this for home use. Yeah, sometimes things just bug me enough that I just have to do something. So what I found was pulling this front panel off so I can get to the inside through the front. It's really not all that much trouble. The 2 bolts that hold the frame to the top have to come off from the inside, and then 6 screws come off the front panel, and you have to pull the knob and the indicator off the front, and then that just lifts out of the way. Not too bad. On the inside, I went ahead and I pulled the shaft because I want to replace that washer back there in that height adjustment. So what you have to do is pull the flange off of the front, and that's what keeps the shaft stable. So that the cranking action actually moves the motor and not the shaft. So that has to be removed from the inside. Then you basically screw this thing all the way back in there until you can pull it up and lift it out of the way, because that shaft has to come out of the point where it pivots right back there. So I've got that out. I'll go ahead and clean it up, but in the meantime, go back to the lathe, and we're going to make some spacers for that to replace the worn out ones. Well, this isn't very difficult. All we need to do is make a flat washer to sit in here. This shaft is 0.433, so I'll need to make a hole that size, and the outer diameter is not critical, so I'm going to use 1-inch Delrin stock, and I'm going to make it 50 thousandths thick based on the washer that was on it. Okay, so we bored the hole through it. Now I've got a parting tool in here, and this will make a groove right there and cut off 50 thousandths of this stock that already has the hole, and we'll have the washer we need. And there it is. Yeah, to get that spring clip back on, what I found was a 12mm socket will push around the outside edge of the clip and push it up onto the shaft. I've got it clamped in place here with the C-clamp, and now all I have to do is just twist the clamp and pinch that together and push that clip right back onto the shaft. Well, not a whole lot to do getting this back together. Once I got those pieces, those Delrin pieces inserted into there and got those back in place, the bottom's almost done. These direct drive units don't have a whole lot to adjust or a whole lot to fix. So we do make sure that everything moves, it's oiled, it's clean. Otherwise, you tear up your cranks in trying to crank something that's really stiff. So let's go through some of the adjustments once we've got this back together and reassembled, and I'll show you what the adjustments were. I'm not going to actually do them. Well, one of the really critical adjustments, and one of the things you do first, is to set the saw blade square to the miter guide. Miter guide is the only thing you can't change or adjust, so it becomes the reference for everything. So we set that square to right along the edge of the miter guide, and we touch off on both edges. Now I've seen some guides tell you to use a tooth and mark it and then rotate it back here and measure at the same tooth. because some blades may have a slight wobble to them, and I think there's some validity to that. So measure it back here, check the gap, measure it up here, and check the gap. And I don't think I need to tell anyone this machine is unplugged, right? We don't touch the blade or get our hands near a machine that has power on it. Okay, on the rip fence, the rip fence is the same thing. It's going to align to the miter guide. And on that track, it's going to be hard to show it, but with the fence, the square part here up against the front guide or rail, pushed up snug, we should have about the same amount of gap at this end as we do at that end with the fence. Right, so it looks pretty close. We can even snug it down. That pulls it tight from the back edge, and that gap looks pretty good. If that is not right, these two bolts right here are loosened because this external part is bolted to the frame through those two, and we can reset that to square, and we may have to go through that 2 or 3 times until it ends up being right. So we've got the blade square to the guide, we've got the fence square to the guide. Now I'm going to shoot this from the back side because it's a little easier to see. But I've got my machinist square sitting flat on the bed. Come up, and we're going to touch off right back here in the back. I can't get in very close and stay in focus, but that is how we get our blade checked to the bed. Now, that is adjusted with the crank, of course, over here, that changes the angle. So if we want a 45-degree cut or a perpendicular cut, we adjust it here, but that's how we check it. And then once it's checked, inside the machine there's a collar. You screw it in so that when the crank hits the stop, it's at 0. We check it up here, make sure it's at 0. With the blade at 0, another check that we can make is to put the square on the miter guide. It's set to 0. And we bring it over and check it up against the blade, and it looks like the gap is the same from one end to the other. So that's good. And all we have to do, that's not really an adjustment. We set the guide until it's square, snug it down, and then loosen the screw and point it exactly at 0, and that calibrates it. So next time you need to go back to 0, you just put it back here. But if you have a critical cut and you actually want to check it, put the square up against the miter guide, check it up against the blade, make sure that that action when you make a cut is square. So we're perpendicular and we're square. We should be square on both in both directions on the wood. Okay, back here at the back of the machine again. So we have the blade guard and the splitter. Those are all adjusted back here. First thing we have to do is set this block, and on this machine there's a couple set screws underneath it. The block is set to perpendicular with a square to be perpendicular to the bed. It's moved until it's right at the end of the shaft and then tightened down. The shaft that it's on pivots with the saw mechanism, so this turns with the blade back and forth. After we've got that tight, the splitter is attached with a screw on the other side. There's a bracket under here with 2 nuts, and we have to set that so that it's set straight to the blade and it's set centered on the blade, so that when a piece of wood comes through, it's cut. Each side of the cut should split and come on each side of this splitter. That makes sense. It's a splitter. Okay. So that's done a lot by eyeball. You can pretty much come down here and sight down the blade, look down that and see the splitter. I know you can't see it in the video, but that should be one continuous straight line, the blade to the splitter, and then the splitter should not veer off. It should be straight on line and centered on the blade. The rip fence here. There's not a whole lot to it. You do have to adjust the guide right here so that you can align it to the scale. This particular rip fence has another adjustment. It has to set off the bed by about a 32nd of an inch, and that's done by adjusting the two rails up and down with their mounting bolts. The nice thing there is this rolls back and forth really easy, so when you're trying to get a specific measurement from the blade to the rip fence, this slides into place. You find the number that you want, square it up, hold it firm, tighten it down, which grips it at the back, and that distance is now what is indicated, if you've adjusted it properly, is the distance here. So you can go between different sizes of cut. If you're ripping different sizes of panel, you can go back and forth on that. But I really like the way this rip fence works. Yeah, here we go. We're ready for a trial run. Got it back on its base, and the base has these really nice retractable casters. It has a lever that you push down and move over with your toe, and it actually drops it down onto the ground rather than having locking casters. And this actually puts the base flat down on the ground. Let's give it a try. Well, I also cut a piece of 2x4 because it's easy to measure and easy to see, but square this way and square that way. So we've got a nice square cut on our wood. Hey, well, that about wraps up this one. Thanks for following along on the rebuild, and I'll try to find something other than a table saw. Seems like I've done 3 in a row. Probably ought to find something else to rebuild. So I'll see what I can dig up, or see what turns up actually, because a lot of times it's just a matter of what I happen to run into. Anyway, thanks for following along. I hope you join me for another one. Bye-bye.